So open up your favorite text editor and create a new file called index.html. We'll start with the HTML5 doc type, which is thankfully much shorter than the HTML4 one. After that, just create a fairly standard HTML page. Now that we have the basic HTML page set up, we can start marking up some of the elements for our app. First up, the tab bar. This is pretty simple as HTML5 has a nav element. If you were following along with the book, you'll notice that we didn't use a nav element there, instead falling back to the old unordered list. This was because the book version is trying to target older devices and we're ignoring them for the sake of simplicity, so we can get away with the newer, shinier syntax. Each one of the list items within our nav is going to have an ID. This ID is going to be important later on as we'll be targeting it when we are capturing events. As per the comps, we're going to have 3 separate tabs, one for spots, one for adding and citing, and one for stars. Hit refresh and you'll see that we're presented with a fairly plain looking nav. Time to make it a bit pretty. We'll need to add a reference to some style sheets. To make our lives a little bit easier, we'll employ a Css Reset, which replaces the default browser styles with our own. HTML Doctor has a great one, and the link to that is in the notes and errata section at the end of the lesson. Add in a reference to reset.css and screen.css. I've put mine in the style sheets directory. Next, open up screen.css. We'll set the font stack for the body. Many devices use Helvetica Neue, so we'll put that at the top of our stack. We'll give our nav bar a base color of black and a slightly lighter border color as a highlight, and then we'll set the position to relative. This will make the children elements relative to our nav even though we set them to position absolute. Next, we'll apply the clear fix hack. Because we're going to float elements in our nav, we run the risk of elements below wrapping up next to the side of it. By placing a block element before and after our nav and then clearing that, we'll ensure that the layout isn't broken. So we don't have to mess with our markup and add extra elements. We'll insert an object using CSS content. There is a link that explains this hack in the notes and errata section. We'll also float our 3 list items and set their width to an even percentage so that they're evenly spaced amongst the tab bar. Now you'll notice that we're using ems instead of pixels. Do you remember ems? They were really popular a couple of years ago on the desktop, mainly because IE6 didn't have page zoom. But as that browser died off, many developers moved back to pixels as it gave us finer control over positioning. Well, they're back. Mobile screens don't have the same dots per inch, so it's entirely possible that 2 phones with the same physical screen size will have different screen resolutions. The iPhone 3 and 4 are perfect examples. The iPhone 4 has a 326 dpi screen, whereas the iPhone 3 only has 163 dpi, meaning that a font that is 12 pixels high is roughly half the size on an iPhone 4. That's not quite how it works, but let's run with that for the moment. Anyway, we're using ems to get around this issue. We're assuming that a 12 pixels is equivalent to 1 em. Looking back at our comps, the Add a Citing button has a slight grey background, so let's drop that in. We'll also add a little negative margin so that it drops below the others. If we have a look at that, you can see the nav bar is starting to take shape. We still have to add some highlights, but we'll do that in a moment. Let's look at getting some of the other elements styled first. The next thing to look at is the main list of celebrity sightings. This is what unordered lists were made for. We've wrapped the distance and sightings in spans so that we can easily target them in our CSS. You might also wonder why we've put the H2 inside the A element. While it's not valid in HTML4, because you can't put a block element inside an inline element, you can in HTML5. So we'll exploit this to make the whole row clickable. By adding slightly different color borders, we can give each row a fake 3D look, which makes it pop out a little bit. We're going to try to do this as much as we can in CSS to reduce the number of images we need to use. We've also used the fancy nth child pseudo class, giving us zebra striping without any extra markup. Of course, this doesn't work on all phones, so if you're targeting some devices that we are ignoring, you'll have to resort to additional class names for odd and even rows. It's not looking too bad, but it really needs some white space, so let's add some more CSS. Awesome, that's looking good. So we've now made each A tag a display block so that the whole row is clickable. We've also made them position relative so we can position child elements absolutely. And we've added a nice text shadow to give it a bit of an embossed look. Next, we'll limit the width so that we can make room for the metadata and icons. Finally, we'll apply some nice rounded corners and position the metadata by setting the top to 50% and applying a negative margin of half the height. And bang, we're done. Of course, we can reuse this style on other lists, as this is the whole reason we've used CSS in the first place.